to say, but we're concerned with the working class as a whole, well, that's far too many people they're gone, right? There's no prospect of ascension or of greater equality or redistribution, and we don't want to even talk about that. You can talk about the declining conditions for the middle class, its inability to reproduce itself, perhaps, but ideology is in a way the work of only setting yourselves problems that you want to resolve or that you're able to resolve. And so that's what the middle class talk is about.
I kind of like that definition of ideology, but particularly the second one, not setting yourself such problems as you can solve, but setting yourself such problems as you would like to solve.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, everyone, particularly you, member of the inner circle of BungaCast, member of the BungaCast Reading Club. We're back discussing class. This is the third edition of this block of discussions and readings on class, and specifically the problem of the middle that we've been discussing through this middle to later part of the year. This is the third edition. We're going to be discussing a piece by Göran Therborn called The Dreams and Nightmares of the World's Middle Classes. I'm going to hand over to George, who's going to tell us more. And
Thanks.
Say hello to Lee first. Wait. Hi, Lee, because it's not Philip Cunliffe, as you may have noticed, but Lee Jones is joining us for this, who is in contact with the world's middle classes. So he can tell us.
He knows the price of a pint of milk, as we've already established before we started recording.
Yes, I do.
No, but he knows China and East Asia stuff, and that's going to come up, and he can tell us about that.
Anyway,
interestingly, I've just noticed, Alex, that you say class and not class. So you're like me. So actually, that's quite strange, because you're a kind of rootless cosmopolitan, pseudo-Swiss, whatever you are, and yet you don't say class. Where did you pick up class?
Well, because my accent is more American originally than it was British, and it mutates depending on whom I'm speaking to. So it's more class. Okay. Class rather than class. I can't even do a Southern English accent.
It falls to me to represent if not the world's middle classes, then the English middle classes, because I can do that Southern class way of talking, not Southern American, Southern English, because I am indeed a proud Southerner. Anyway, I wanted to first recap last month's discussion, just really, really briefly. So we were talking about Franz Jakubowski and the central claim that they, as in the middle classes, only come into contact with the basic phenomenon of capitalism, the commodity, when it is in circulation. And we had a discussion about whether we thought this was true or not, whether we thought this was important or not. We talked about Christopher Lasch and his idea about the manipulation of symbolic forms and the importance of credentialization, and how this leads to a plastic view of the world, which has a lot of similarities to this Jakubowski's central claim, because he builds out from this only coming into contact with the commodity. It shapes your whole worldview. And the conclusion, which I think was disputed, but I'm still going to take it as the conclusion because I get to summarize, is that the PMC is the only class today, as it's the best organized and most ideological. Alex, I think, was more of a dissenting voice, and Phil was more on my side. So that's why Alex had to get rid of Phil for this discussion and load the jury.
Can come on to this. We can come on to this matter. I'm sure it'll emerge as we go through this discussion as well. So.
Yeah. Anyway, that's putting it in a bit of a polemical way, because I think that the discussion was much richer and more nuanced, blah, 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 than that. But yeah, listeners, please do go back and listen to that if you would like to. I think it was a good chat. So just a very brief introduction to Göran Therborn, a Swedish sociologist, regular contributor to New Left Review and author of among many other books. What does the ruling class do when it rules? From 1978, the ideology of power and the power of ideology from 1980, and from Marxism to post-Marxism from 2008, which is a good summary of the state of Marxism today. And we previously discussed his very pessimistic essay, again from New Left Review, The World and the Left, in episode 308. Won't give away everything that we that he says there, but it's essentially that whatever the forces, historical forces were that generated opposition to the ruling ideology and to capitalism, they don't exist anymore. So not just that there's no opposition, but there's no possibility for creating one. So a bit of a downer, potentially. But if you're in the mood for that, listener, do go back.
I don't remember that being so fatalistic. I mean, I remember it being realistic, I think, in a way that we would all agree about the possibilities for emancipation today. But not that it was so fatalist. But
well, again, I'm summarizing, so I get to put my own particular.
I'll have to go back and listen to some of the excellent material from the immense BungaCast back catalogue.
Yes, that does sound like fun, doesn't it? So just before we get started, a pair of questions to my my co-host here. Are you familiar with Göran Therborn's work? Anything to kind of throw in there beyond the that very short introduction that I just gave? And if you don't have anything to say to that, what does the ruling class do when it rules, either in your opinion or in Therborn's? I've got my own. Again, I've got my own spin on all of these questions. So take it away.
Well, I mean, it's Göran, not Goran. That would be my first contribution.
La-di-da.
It's a great contribution.
Internet, you can look it up. It's that's what the internet there's for.
I like to anglicize people's names because it makes them feel more welcome. Because
Goran he's been anyway.
He's been in Cambridge for a long while, so
I haven't actually read any of his books. I am kind of familiar with the broad kind of structuralist sociology that he made his name in, and also the fact that I think he's become more of a kind of empirical comparativist as we've kind of gone along and left behind some of the touch points of like 1970s neo-Marxism. But no, I haven't read What Does the Ruling Class Do When It Rules. I'm kind of broadly familiar with the argument about kind of institutionalized class rule through the state, etc., going against that basic, very 19th century and reductionist kind of Marxian vision or argument where it's just the state is the ruling committee of the bourgeoisie. It's like, no, it's a little bit more complicated than that, which indeed it is.
That's kind of how I remember that book, although it's been a long time since I read it. That the argument was that what the ruling class does when it rules is it reproduces its own domination. It does so by controlling the economy and the state apparatus, meaning the ideological state apparatus. And the state is involved in mediating and regulating the bourgeoisie's exploitation of the proletariat. And what else are they doing? They're generating leaders that uphold their class domination. And they use the state to kind of mediate social relations and also to position themselves internationally too. And I suppose one question relevant to this discussion is, are they doing this very effectively today? Because something that we've discussed a few times is the idea that the professional managerial class is basically doing the task of organizing hegemony on behalf of the ruling class at the moment. And of course, they're not doing it very well. So, and yet the ruling class doesn't seem to be able to step in. This links us back to previous discussions in the reading club on, what is the ruling class doing? What is the bourgeoisie doing? They don't seem to be very organized. They don't seem very capable of organizing their own hegemony. And we also discussed this with Ilya Salami in the episode on state capitalism. So maybe this book is a little bit outdated. Maybe it's also a 20th century artifact.
Or maybe it gives an important insight, because I would put it even more crudely that what the ruling class does when it rules is it reproduces itself. It's less important that it rules than that it maintains its class position. And so could you argue that the ruling class is reproducing itself kind of fine and it's outsourced the management
very
of society?
well, in fact, yeah.
No, this is my point. But where they're outsourcing the management of the state and consequently the management of hegemony, right? Through the state, they are mediating social relations. They're regulating their exploitative relationship with the working class. But by outsourcing it to the professional managerial class, they fucked it all up. That's the point. So yes, it's true to say that bourgeois hegemony, bourgeois domination is unchallenged. So that the bourgeoisie as a class is reproducing itself, but its hegemony is not being reproduced. Its hegemony is clearly crumbling into just rank domination.
Yeah,
and you
this
argue it's because they've outsourced it to the PMC and they fucked it up.
And so this could be an intermediate stage where the ruling class is reproducing itself without reproducing the conditions for reproducing itself, and so ultimately this process of reproduction might be undermined. Anyway, we're not talking about the ruling class. Maybe that is a topic for another section of the reading club. But also, I did want to also point to Therborn's book Science, Class and Society on the Formation of Sociology and Historical Materialism, which I just remembered. And this is I think it's a really interesting account of and again, I'm going to summarize it really crudely, of the emergence of sociology. Basically, he, as far as I remember, he says, well, you had political theory, which was asserting equality in practice. And, after the French Revolution, particularly over the course of the 19th century, you had people realizing, well, we have all these principles of equality, but it doesn't work. It's, we don't have equality in practice. So that's the kind of the sociological question, is why are the principles that supposedly govern society not actualized? And that's a sociological explanation, or that's the kind of sociological question that Therborn says defines the discipline as it emerges. Anyway, I think an interesting thinker, lots of things of interest to say, but we're not talking about any of those books. We're in fact talking about, as Alex trailed, Dreams and Nightmares of the World's Middle Classes. So this is from the July-August 2020 issue of New Left Review, and Therborn starts with the idea that, quote, the middle class has a discursive centrality in the early 21st century corresponding to that of the working class a century before. So we've kind of touched on this perhaps to a certain extent, or maybe it's been one of the kind of the reasons why I wanted particularly to do the middle class as a section of the reading club, is that it does feel like if the 20th century was about the working class, or that's one way to understand the discourse, as it were, 21st century discourse, it seems like everyone's talking about these middle class people, we want to get into that conversation. And I think there's some reasons why Therborn says this is the case, which we can touch on. And then the kind of starting point of the essay itself is, Therborn sets it up as a bit of a question. So some people argue we're all middle class now, such as Homi Karas, former World Bank chief economist, or The Economist in 2009, talking about 2 million more bourgeois. Whilst on the other hand, you have
2 billion more
billion.
Bourgeois.
Did I say 2 million?
Mm.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry to those.
Because 2 million more bourgeois
has,
because it's a very big difference, because 2 million more bourgeois, you're like, yeah, that's entirely what has
Probably
happened.
about right.
2 billion
Yes.
more bourgeois, I don't think so.
Okay. Sorry to I was erasing the existence of these hundreds of millions, almost 2 billion bourgeois.
That was a useful pedantic intervention.
It was actually, yeah, sorry. I mean, those sorts of things matter, like in finance or in describing things.
Orders of magnitude errors, yeah.
So 2 billion more bourgeois that The Economist pointed to in 2009, whereas others such as Peter Temin, who's an emeritus professor at MIT, he's not the only one, but worry about the vanishing middle class. So which is correct? Is there 2 billion more, 2 million more, or fewer? We will get into all of this. It's worth repeating, as we've said in some of the previous reading clubs. This is a bit more empirical than some of the theoretical other papers or readings that we've discussed. That's not to say that there's not some theory in there. So to kick things off, a bit of history. Therborn notes that the term middle class enters the English language between 1790 and 1830, according to Eric Hobbes, and sees three major concepts circling the same phenomenon in the 19th century. So you have the English middle class, complemented by the German Bürgertum and the French bourgeoisie. So the major difference between discussions in the 19th century, where you have these three concepts kind of circling each other, and contemporary discussions, is that previously the middle class was defined by work to differentiate it from the rentier nobility, whereas today it's defined in terms of consumption. Do you kind of buy this shift? What does Therborn attribute this shift to, and do you buy his explanation?
I think that I think it's fairly straightforward. I mean, we're all familiar with the way that the middle class understood in the 19th century as a rising bourgeoisie as against the aristocracy. That the term that attaches to that comes to mean something entirely different by the time the 20th century rolls around, where it refers broadly to the kind of some broad mass of the middle of society, and these have very different conceptualizations, and we're going to come on to all of this, which I think Therborn is very useful in depicting the different ways that policy wonks, for example, talk about the middle class today, and that means various different things in different parts of the world. I think, in a way, British English is a bit of an exception to the kind of broader discussion around the middle class, because British English has retained the sense of middle class as meaning posh, effectively as meaning bourgeois, whereas in the US, of course, it's gone in radically the other direction, where it is taken to mean akin to working class, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I don't think he's entirely right about the definitions all now being about consumption. This is a slightly pedantic point, but in the UK, the standard system,
as you like.
The standard system is you talk about people being A, B, C1, C2, D, and E, and they're occupational groups. And even some of the literature that Therborn discusses later is actually about occupational groups. I think that's the slightly pedantic point. But I think the more interesting point is, what does he attribute it to? He says it's a celebration of victory and power on the part, presumably on the part of the capitalist class. It's not quite clear whose victory and power it is, but certainly the defeat of the working class. So he says, look, during the Cold War, we would never have talked about bourgeois this or capitalist that, but now you can talk about it with complete abandon. In the past, you would have used business community or some euphemism or something like that. And I think I understand what he means about that, and I buy that up to a point. But as we'll come on to later, one of the core reports that he quotes is this World Bank definition of middle class in 2009 as people living on between $2 and $13 per day, in order to come up with this idea that there's a burgeoning global middle class. If that's your definition of middle class, that doesn't strike me as triumphalism. What's the triumph there? The triumph of lowered horizons, right? If you think about it compared to modernization theory in the past, that you would have had stable, large professional middle classes all enjoying, Western style lifestyles. No chance. This is just a celebration of another definition is the notion of a middle class that began just above the poorest 20% of the population, who in poor countries tend to be very poor indeed. So I think he's wrong actually about the triumphalism.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually.
I mean, we're maybe getting ahead of ourselves a tiny bit, but I think it's a really important point. And he kind of explains this and says this is because, particularly when looking at the global south, middle class is basically counterposed to poverty. So it's all about reducing poverty and increasing the middle class. And that, is that triumphalist? Maybe from the perspective of the global north, you have fewer kind of charity advertising campaigns to lift people out of poverty, and that's a kind of look what you've achieved, look what capitalism has achieved. But yeah, there certainly isn't a kind of fuller account of what middle class means, other than not being under a kind of a given material line, which is obviously always projected into the global south from the global north. Anyway, sorry, Alex.
No, just on the point about triumphalism, I guess it's a triumphalism of the capitalist class in line with, end of history triumphalism, right? Where accounts have been settled, and now there's this whole mass of people that we can sell refrigerators to. Because that's what it basically is, right? It's people who are able to send their children to school. I didn't say university, to school, and complete maybe secondary education, and that they might have, consumer white goods, for example. They might own a car, right? It's that level of income, particularly when we're talking about the new middle classes of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And so the triumphalism is, I guess, that I entirely agree with Lee. It's a very good point about lowered horizons. It's very different to an image of catch-up development, modern, and the ideals were conveyed by modernization theory of an eventual world convergence. It's not that at all. It's just, hey, we're all in a consumer society now.
Yeah, and I guess so. Therborn does obviously refer to the Communist Manifesto, but not in a lot of detail. This kind of revolutionary role of the bourgeoisie trying to remake the world in its own image. He references this Schiller line that work is the burgher's ornament, and Carlyle saying, "Blessed is he who has found his work; let him ask no other blessedness." So previously perhaps there is this kind of both this association with work and also this like sense of a mission or of a kind of being chosen, if you want to take it down a kind of Protestant, or being part of the elect, if you want to take it in a kind of Weberian Calvinist direction. And all of those things seem to be quite washed out, and maybe it is now fridges or other things which increasingly come to define what it means to be middle class in the 21st century. So just going back to that kind of point that I set up at the top about the 20th century being the kind of working class century, which I think is, as I've already said, I think is correct. And I wonder if this means that the 21st century is going to be not just the middle class century, but the PMC century. I know this is something which Alex is terribly triggered by, but I'll just read out what Therborn says, because I think and this is often the strength of the stuff that he writes. It's very panoramic, both like globally and also so if you're like on top of a hill and you're looking like side to side, that's a panorama. But if you have a depth of field as well, is that panoramic? It's like panoramic in two dimensions, but it's not telescopic. It's just got a foreground and a back. What I'm trying to say is it's got a lot of geography and a lot of history, if that makes sense.
High aperture. Anyway, whatever.
We can brainstorm this later. Anyway, I think I'm losing the point that I'm trying to make here, which is completely my own fault. So yeah, Therborn says, quote, "The end of the working class century had an economic basis in the accelerating deindustrialization and financialization of the capitalist core. More obliquely, a sociological factor was the social dissolution stemming from the 1968 cultural movement. Yet this did not immediately herald a new middle class dawn." So I think it's just worth putting that out there as essentially a kind of, an interregnum, or it isn't a straightforward movement from the working class century to the middle class century. Is he right about this, Alex? Is this a chance for you to come back on this idea that 21st century might be the PMC century?
I mean, I just think that's nonsense on so many levels from top to bottom. I mean, firstly is that we're 25 years into this century. It's a little bit too soon to pronounce on that. But even allowing for your amazing powers of prognostication that you may be able to see more deeply and further into the future because of your higher aperture on your lens, PMC, as I've mentioned many times, in these discussions anyway, doesn't have much coherence as a class because it unites effectively educated proletarians with people with real power, influence, and wealth, and that their unity over certain political points or preferences, I think is a conjunctural matter, not a structural one. More importantly, actually, is that all the literature on the PMC, or most of it, emphasizes precisely not its unity and coherence, but its bifurcation, right? That you have 1/3 of the class doing very well, and 2/3 of it, which is downwardly mobile, indeed unable to reproduce itself, a point that we've discussed a number of times on this podcast. And then finally, I think, which is the most important if we're looking forward, which is that the big tendencies of AI and automation point to a real threat to those with white-collar jobs, making those jobs routinized and even proletarianized. So the idea that the PMC, that people with white-collar intellectual jobs, intellectual labor, will be kind of somehow hegemonic and powerful and wealthy into the future seems to me completely wrong. If there is what there is, and this, if we're going to make statements about what the 21st century is, it's the managerial elite, right? It's people who have a very high income from labor and capital at the same time. So people who are managing large organizations, whether they're public sector, private sector, whatever, and who draw income also from capital and labor, right? This is what Branko Milanovic calls homoplutia. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that, but effectively that they draw wealth from two different sections, right? From ownership of capital and indeed probably rent as well, and also from their income, and that seems to be more the vision of the future. It's the managerial elite.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.
De A ou pas se taire.